I want to focus our attention on something today. You know, there's one ingredient that any successful endeavor has to have. A lot of attention has been focused in the last, even 2 or 3 weeks on the Normandy invasion, and the fact that we have just passed the 50th anniversary of D-Day. Now, that was a major undertaking, one of the really the tremendous undertakings of World War II, and was a history-making event. But whether you're talking about some giant endeavor, whether you're talking about something on a grand scale, or whether you're talking about simply pursuing a college education or making a marriage work, regardless of whether it is something that is a part of everyday life or something that is on a grand scale, there is one common ingredient that every successful endeavor has to have, or the participants, let's say, those involved in carrying through any successful endeavor. That ingredient is commitment. There has to be commitment. You don't get anything accomplished, you don't follow through and finish something if you're not committed to it. If you're not committed to your family, if you're not committed to making your marriage work, then it'll fall apart. If someone begins to pursue an education, they maybe go to college, young person, but they have no particular commitment to getting this education, sooner or later they won't. They'll quit. Something else will come up. If you're going to follow through with something, the individuals who were involved in the Normandy invasion had a commitment to accomplishing that action. You can't accomplish or achieve any worthwhile endeavor unless you have a commitment to do so. Now, that certainly applies in our own Christian life. That applies in the lives that we live before God and following through. You're not going to successfully endure and overcome unless you have a commitment. I'm not going to successfully endure and overcome unless I have a commitment, a deep, abiding commitment. Now, there are two things that can undermine your sense of commitment. Two things that can cause a commitment sort of fall apart. There are two sets of circumstances, let's say, that can serve to undermine commitment. One is hard times, and the other is good times. Now, that pretty well takes you in most times, right? Hard times or good times, and if you eliminate, what else is there? Well, now let's think about that a little bit. You know, hard times, pressures, problems, difficulties, a lot of stress and trials, that can really try and test your commitment and your level of commitment. When things get hard and things get rough, when there's a lot of pressure and a lot of difficulty, that's hard to follow through with a commitment. But you know, when things are easy and things are comfortable and times are good and life is easy, you know, that's an easy time to forget about a commitment. Now, I want to call our attention to both. In the book of Numbers, chapter 13, we pick up the story here where God had told Moses to send men in to search the land of Canaan that I'm going to give to the children of Israel. And they were to send a man from every tribe. We find that in verse 25 of Numbers 13, they returned from searching the land after 40 days. Spent almost 6 weeks going through the land. They came back to Moses and Aaron and the congregation in verse 26, and they showed them the fruit of the land. And it was impressive fruit, because you find up in verse 23, they had actually cut a bunch of grapes that there by the brook Eshcol, and they tied this cluster of grapes on a staff, and it took 2 men to carry it. Now, when you and I think in terms of a cluster of grapes, I think, what you get there at Del Champs or Winn-Dixie. You go in there and you get this little cluster of grapes, it's about as big as your hand, and stick it in a little sack, and you go through the checkout counter, and you've got your cluster of grapes. I never had to get, one of you or some neighbor or friend or something to come along with me so we could get this cluster of grapes and we could tie it to a stick. And I'd get on one end of the stick and he'd get on the other, and we'd carry this cluster of grapes out of the store. You ever had to do that? This was a big cluster of grapes. This was, now they came back and they had all of this fruit and they had all of these things, and they said, it is a land of milk and honey. It is a rich land. Yes, it is. Verse 28, but the people are strong that dwell in the land. The cities are walled, very great. We saw the children of Anak there. The Amalekites dwell in the south. The Hittites, Jebusites, Amorites dwell in the mountains. Canaanites dwell by the sea. Caleb stilled the people, verse 30, and said, let us go up at once and possess it, for we're well able to overcome them. But the men that went up with him said, we're not able to go up against the people. They are stronger than we. And they brought an evil report of the land. And they said, it's a land that eats up the inhabitants thereof, and the people are giants, and we're like grasshoppers before them. Chapter 14, verse 1, the congregation lifted up their voice and cried, and the people wept that night, and all the congregation murmured against Moses and against Aaron. Said, we wish we'd died in Egypt. We wish we'd died in the wilderness. You brought us out here, and we're going to die, and our children are going to die. Let's just make a captain and go back to Egypt. Now, they had come out of Egypt with a high hand. Supposedly, they were committed to making the journey from Egypt to the Promised Land. They were excited. They had a commitment, or they said they did, as they came out of the land of Egypt. They were committed to going in and to receiving all of the inheritance of the Promised Land. Now they ran into difficulty. And you know what? They were afraid. Their fears overpowered them. They were intimidated by what lay ahead. And you know, the pressures, the problems, the fear of great calamity can turn people aside from their commitment. Back in the book of Nehemiah, Nehemiah had some problems as the Jews in his day had come back from Babylon, and he was confronted with a problem. Nehemiah had come back to rebuild the city of Jerusalem. And in Nehemiah chapter 4 and verse 1, it came to pass, when Sanballat, who was the leader of the Samaritans, heard that we built the wall, he was wroth, and he took great indignation, and he mocked the Jews. And he spoke before his brethren in the army of Samaria and said, what are these feeble Jews? They're going to do these things? And so it comes on down. In verse 8, you find they conspired together to fight against Jerusalem and the inhabitants. They threatened. They intimidated. There were all sorts of things that were going on. In chapter 6, you read in verse 2 that Sanballat sent a message to Nehemiah, and some said, come, let us meet together. Notice the end of verse 2. Nehemiah 6, the end of verse 2. But they thought to do me mischief. They were trying to lure Nehemiah out and get him out of the way, and they were going to beat him up or kill him or something. They made all sorts of accusations, and they tried to intimidate, and they tried to threaten. And they came in, notice down here in verse 9, they all made us afraid. Saying their hands shall be weakened from the work, that it be not done. And so he came here, Nehemiah says, I came to the house of Shimei, and he had the door locked. Everything was all closed up. And he said, look, let's meet together in the house of God within the temple. We'll go in there and we'll shut the doors of the temple. For they're going to come and kill you. And in the night they're going to come and slay you. And I said, should such a man as I flee? Who is there that, being as I am, would go into the temple to save his life? I will not go in. I perceived that God had not sent him. And so, in verse 13, he was hired that I should be afraid. And this was the case. So, what do you have here? You find, coming on down, that the whole point was to scare Nehemiah, to intimidate the people, to frighten them, to threaten them. That there were great difficulties, great adversity, great problem and stress and pressure that was being put on to scare them into backing away from the commitment they had made when they came out of Babylon. All efforts were being made to frighten and to intimidate the people of God into backing down. So they were threatening to kill Nehemiah. One fellow came along and said, look, you better get away from here. They're going to kill you. I'll tell you what, why don't we go over here to the temple and you can hide here? And Nehemiah realized, wait a minute, I'm not going to do that. In fact, I think you're the one who's out to get me. You're trying to lure me off over here. Well, there were all sorts of attempts that were made to intimidate, to threaten, to frighten. We could go through the Bible. We could look at example after example. We could look at Daniel and his three friends there in Babylon. You remember the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and the threats that were made to them as to how they were going to be burned in this fiery furnace if they didn't worship the image that the king of Babylon had set up. They had made a commitment to God. Now, as you look through the story, you find some people were frightened and scared and backed off. Other people were not. Some carried through on their commitment and some were dissuaded from their commitments. Some were intimidated to the point that they put aside the commitment that they had made. Hard times, pressures of trials and difficulties and adversities can be a very overwhelming thing when it comes to a commitment. But not only can a lot of stress and trial and difficulty, can threats and intimidation of warfare, of conflict, of being hurt, of being brutalized in some way, not only can a direct frontal assault undermine a commitment, but sometimes something that even more effectively does it, another sort of hard times, is something that is stretched out over a long period of time. The discouragement that comes in from a prolonged trial. Something that seems to hang on. See, hard times, difficulties, pressures, and trials can undermine commitment. It can either be a direct attack and something that creates fear and intimidation, and that sort of backs people off of their commitment. But sometimes a person will stand up. They see something that's coming directly at them, and so they recognize it for what it is, and I'm committed, and they go in there. Well, what about something that just drags on and on and on, that has a wearing effect? Notice back in the book of Judges. There are many places we could go in the book of Judges. In Judges chapter 6, we'll pick it up. Judges 6 and verse 1. The children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Eternal, and the Eternal delivered them into the hand of Midian for 7 years. And the hands of Midian prevailed against Israel. And because of the Midianites, the children of Israel made them the dens which are in the mountains and caves and strongholds. When Israel had sown, the Midianites came up, and the Amalekites, they came up and encamped against them and destroyed the increase of the earth. They left no sustenance for Israel, neither for sheep, nor ox, nor ass. They came up with their cattle and their tents, and they were like grasshoppers. And they entered into the land. In verse 6, Israel was greatly impoverished because of the Midianites, and the children of Israel cried unto the Lord. They were really worn down. Now, 7 years, if we're reading it here in the book of Judges and it doesn't take us long to read it, you think, well, 7 years, that wasn't too bad, that wasn't too long. How would you like to go through a trial that lasted 7 years, where every time you started to put something together, somebody came in and tore it up? You see, one of the advantages you have when you read it in Judges is you know how it ended. If you don't know how it ended, take another 5 minutes and read on down. By that time, you're on through the story of Gideon. Yeah, God raised up Gideon, and Gideon came in, and he smote the Amalekites, and God delivered Israel. That's right, but you know how their trial went? Same way yours goes. A day at a time. You're in the middle of it, and you don't know when it's going to end. You don't know how long. What they knew was they planted a crop one day, and as things were getting on up and getting close to harvest time, all of a sudden here came these marauding bands that came in and burned houses, and in some cases burned the crops, and in other cases came in and chased them off and killed animals and harvested and stole the crops. And what they didn't steal, they destroyed. And people wound up scattering, and after a while you had people who were hiding in dens and caves because they were burning villages and burning farms and just marauding and destroying. And it didn't happen just once, one season. It happened the next year. And then the third year it happened again. And the fourth year it happened again. And the fifth year it happened again. And the sixth year it happened again. And people had to slaughter animals, and animals had starved and died, and people were hungry, and they were scared, and they were frightened, and there was no one to deliver them, and it lasted on and on and on. And you come on up here a little further, and we find when we first meet Gideon here in Judges 6 and verse 11, that Gideon was threshing wheat by the winepress to hide it from the Midianites. So here he was, frightened, off over here in a little corner, hiding somewhere behind the winepress, down here threshing this little bit of wheat, which would wind up being really about no more wheat than he'd be able to thresh in a little cramped environment like that. He was just sort of enough to eat day by day, just trying to survive. Well, it was a very miserable existence, and it went on and on and on for 7 years. And the people were sapped of their strength, of their vitality, of their enthusiasm, of their whole sense of commitment. You could go through, you could read the story of Job. You could read various accounts where long-standing problems just wore away and just ground people down. Hard times can be hard on commitment. Whether it's a direct frontal assault through fear and intimidation that scares people and causes them to back off of what they were intending to do because they're frightened, or whether it's just something that hangs on and just grinds them down and they get discouraged and they get frustrated and just, again, just sort of discouraged and they give up, they quit. Either way, they don't endure. Whether they're frightened and turn tail and run, or whether they just get discouraged and give up and say, well, what's the use? Either way, they didn't follow through the commitment. There's no way you can carry any endeavor to success if you're not committed to achieving that ultimate outcome. If your commitment is shallow, if your commitment is not real, and it's not enduring, you won't follow through. Hard times will come. Sometimes it can be one direct thing. Sometimes it can just be a long series of things. Hard times, whether through fear or through discouragement, can cause a person to back off of following through on that commitment. But not only can hard times be an enemy to commitment, good times can be an enemy to commitment too. Now, between hard times and good times, there's not much time left, are there? There are a couple of keys to maintaining commitment through hard times and through good times, and the people who successfully follow through on their commitments, the men and women in the pages of this book of whom we read, who followed through on their commitments, practice those two keys. And anyone who really follows through on their commitments, whether it was in a secular sense, whether it was waging a war, winning a battle, whether it is people who follow through on their commitments in life, there are a couple of keys. I'm not going to tell you what they are yet. We're going to come back and look at it in a minute. But how do good times undermine commitment? How is it that good times, as well as bad times, can undermine that sense of commitment? Because they certainly can. We were reading in Nehemiah. Let's just go on here a little further in Nehemiah. Now, Nehemiah was threatened with all sorts of things to scare him, to intimidate him. There were people that came up and threatened war. They wrote all sorts of nasty letters. They did everything they could to scare and frighten the people, and to scare and frighten Nehemiah himself. It was not successful. In fact, you read in Nehemiah 6, verse 15, the wall was finished in the 25th day of the month Elul in 52 days. You realize that? Nehemiah finished the wall in less than 2 months. The whole wall, all the way around Jerusalem. He goes on and he describes, they worked around the clock. They worked in 2 12-hour shifts. They worked at night, they worked in the daytime, 6 days a week. Other than the Sabbath, they never shut down. And when all these threats were made, Nehemiah put 2 out there at a given job. One held a sword and the other had a shovel. And they just swapped off. And he was constantly making the rounds and encouraging the people. And they went forward. And just an incredible thing. I won't go through the details, but if you start going through and looking at the geography of what they did and consider the massive endeavor and the length of time it took, you talk about a man that had commitment and fired everybody else up to have that commitment, and nothing backed him down. And the people were all excited, and a great job was accomplished. You can read all these things. He talks about in verse 19 of chapter 6 how Tobiah sent letters to put me in fear. There were all sorts of things to try and scare the people. But they came through all these hard times and everything went well. Now, when you come on back to Nehemiah chapter 13, in verse 6, you find that at this time, Nehemiah was not in Jerusalem. For in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, came I unto the king, and after certain days obtained I leave of the king, and I came to Jerusalem. Here was Nehemiah. He was there in Jerusalem. He was the governor. He rebuilt the walls, all the threats, all the intimidation, all the attempts at frightening him and threatening war and assassination attempts. None of these things slowed it down. There was great zeal and great excitement. The people were all fired up, and they were working just continual shifts and accomplished seemingly the impossible. The job was done. The work of God was accomplished, that specific aspect of it. And Nehemiah's term in Jerusalem was up, and he went back to Babylon and was there in the king's court for a period of time, and then obtained permission from the king to return to Jerusalem. And you know what he found when he got back there? A number of years, about 10 years or so, had passed. Nehemiah came back. And When he came back, what he found in verse 7, I came to Jerusalem and I understood the evil that Eliashib, who was the high priest, did for Tobiah. Prepared him a chamber in the courts of the house of God. Now, Tobiah was one of the Samaritan leaders. And the high priest had fixed him an apartment right up there in the temple. And Nehemiah says, it grieved me sore. Therefore I cast out all the household stuff of Tobiah out of the chamber. And I commanded that they cleanse the chamber. And I brought in the vessels of the house of God. Nehemiah was outraged. He came in there and what is this? Oh, this is Tobiah's apartment. He sort of moved in here. You know, all of a sudden you didn't want to be down underneath the window. Because, beds and couches and chairs and pictures and whatever else he had in there, crucifixes or whatever he had on the wall, all of it came sailing out the window, you know. Nehemiah was cleaning this place out. Called somebody in to scrub the place down. And then he perceived in verse 10 that the portions of the Levites had not been given them. The Levites and the singers that did the work were fled everyone to his field. Where are the Levites? Where are all the people? Oh, well, they've sort of gone back and they've gotten jobs and they're back. They've gone farming and everything. Oh, people quit tithing, huh? Nobody's bringing in the tithe. So the Levites, they quit and they went and got them another job. And he comes on down. In verse 15, in those days saw I some in Judah treading wine presses on the Sabbath and bringing in sheaves. You know what had happened in the time Nehemiah was gone? Life was easy and times were good. They discovered that, the Samaritans wouldn't give them nearly so much trouble if they would just be more like the Samaritans. Samaritans quit persecuting them. The Samaritans quit trying to intimidate them and threaten them. After they built the leader of the Samaritans, said, well, here, why don't you just come on in, move on into the temple. When you're in town, you just stay right up here next to the high priest. That's fine. And we'll enter into all these agreements, and you find that they intermarried with them. And verse 23 of Nehemiah 13, in those days saw I some of the Jews that had married wives of Ashdod and Ammon and Moab, and their children spoke half in the speech of Ashdod and couldn't speak the Jews' language. Well, I guess not. Good times, the enticement, the allure of the world around, people got comfortable. Good times can be just as seriously undermining of commitment as hard times can be. And sometimes it can be even more so because it's more subtle. They got comfortable. After they made a few compromises and started watering some things down, well, the Samaritans weren't their enemies anymore. They got along well, and they were trading, and they were making money. And, of course, interestingly enough, as they started making more money, somehow they couldn't afford to keep tithing, because they got more concerned about money. And then having to shut everything down every Sabbath, well, that sort of interfered with trade too. And besides, the Samaritans, they were, that was a busy day for them. So Nehemiah came back, and what he found was that while the threats and the intimidation hadn't worked, the allure, the enticement of the good times had. Their commitment had been sapped. Now, Nehemiah's commitment wasn't sapped. Just go through and read the chapter. When he finished with them, all of a sudden, every time I read this account of Nehemiah, it reminds me of Mr. Herbert Armstrong at the Feast of Tabernacles in Big Sandy back quite a number of years ago, back about, I don't know what that was, feast of about 1980 or something like that, 81. Those of you who were there, you may not remember the year, but you remember the feast if you were there. I always just sort of think, look forward to meeting Nehemiah in the resurrection, and I sort of suspect that he's going to be a little bit like Mr. Herbert Armstrong in terms of that sort of personality. When Nehemiah got through with them, they were ready to repent and get on the straight and narrow, as long as Nehemiah was there. That sounds a little familiar too, doesn't it? The good times, the comfortable times, the easy times had a way of undermining their commitment. You could go back, Numbers, chapter 25. Now, in Numbers 25, we're reading the results of what Balaam had done. You remember Balaam? Balaam was the false prophet that the king of Moab wanted a curse put on the Israelites. And so he decided to send and hire Balaam to come and put a curse on the Israelites, because Balaam was the great pagan religious leader. Well, Balaam really wanted the job. The king offered him quite a bit of money to come down there and put a curse on them, and so Balaam was ready for the job. God sent a message to Balaam. He said, Balaam, I don't want you to go. Well, Balaam was really disappointed. We're told in the New Testament, you see, that Balaam loved the wages of unrighteousness. Balaam loved money. He was willing to do just about anything or preach just about anything if the price was right. And they offered him a large sum of money. And God said, Balaam, I really don't want you to go down there. I'm not going to curse the Israelites. Well, Balaam was very reluctant to turn this down, and he kept trying to wheedle around and figure if there wasn't a way. And God said, well, I'm not going to stop you from going. Balaam said, that's good enough. You know, that's the way some people are. They're a little bit like Balaam. They really want to do something. And if they don't think they're going to get in terrible trouble at the moment, they're going to go ahead and do it, because that's really what they want to do. Like, well, I don't think lightning will strike. I don't think I'll get kicked out. I'll do it. You see, they asked the wrong question. Balaam asked the wrong question. Balaam's question was, is God going to do something to me right now? God says, no, I won't stop you. Good. That's good enough. The question Balaam should have asked, and the question all of us should ask, is what does God really want me to do? See, it's not a matter of, is God going to zap me at the moment? The question is, what would God really like for me to do? What would be God's preference? What would God really desire? That was not Balaam's question. Balaam wasn't concerned about what God's preference was. Balaam knew that the king of Moab paid well. So Balaam had his preference. In fact, I think one of the funniest stories in the Bible is the story of Balaam trying to make his trip down there. God showed that even a jackass was smarter than Balaam. Well, Balaam got on his donkey, and he was riding along, and all of a sudden the donkey stopped. Any of you who've ever fooled with a donkey knows when a donkey stops, you just almost can't get them to move. And Balaam tried to, he kicked him and he beat him and he hit him and he was just having a fit trying to get this donkey to move, and the donkey just stood there. And finally, the donkey turned around and looked at him and said, what in the world are you hitting me for? And Balaam was so frustrated, he talked back. And he said, well, you won't move. You're a lousy donkey. And the donkey said, look, I've been a good donkey all these years. You ever had trouble with me like this before? Balaam said, no. He said, well, the point was, God sent an angel that blocked the road. The donkey could see the angel, and the donkey wouldn't go. The donkey had enough sense to stop when God blocked the way. When God blocked the way for Balaam, Balaam looked for an alternate route. That was Balaam's approach. Instead of taking the hint, maybe God doesn't want me going this direction, Balaam said, there's got to be a way around that angel. That's the way sometimes people live their lives, They're sort of like Balaam. They're not quite as smart as his donkey. The donkey had enough sense to say, if God doesn't want me going this way, I think I'll just stop right here. I'm not going to go any further. Well, if you read back in the book of Revelation, I'll just, for the sake of time, I'll summarize with one verse as to what Balaam did. And then I'm going to show you Numbers 25, because that sets the stage. In Revelation 2:14, we're told that Balaam taught Balak to cast a stumbling block before the children of Israel, to eat things sacrificed to idols, and to commit fornication. See, Balaam came up with an idea. He told Balak, he said, look, God won't let me put a curse on. Any enchantment I use, nothing will work. But I'll tell you what will. Have a party. Let the liquor flow and the girls come on out and sort of tell the Israelites, hey guys, come on down. We're having a party. Y'all come. And you get them down there and get them all liquored up, and pretty soon they're dancing around and they're worshiping the idol, and they're cavorting around with all these girls, and you got all this immorality going on and all these things. He said God's going to look down at that mess and He'll wipe them out. And that'll solve the problem. Just entice them. They'll forget their commitment with the good times. And you know what? A lot of them did. That's what you read of in Numbers 25. You see, the people began to commit whoredom with the daughters of Moab. They called the people unto the sacrifices of their gods. The people did eat and bowed down to the gods. And Israel joined themselves unto Baal Peor, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. I mean, it got pretty raunchy. You could go on through the account. This was Balaam's contribution. You see, if hard times won't subvert the commitment of God's people, then let's try good times. People get comfortable. They get lazy. You know, isn't it interesting that the commitment of our nation has been far more sapped by the prosperity of the post-war era than it was by all of the threats and all of the adversity that Hitler and the Japanese threw at our nation, the hard times of the 1940s. People rallied to a cause with a commitment that has since been sapped and undermined because they're so comfortable they don't want to be inconvenienced. People get comfortable and they don't want to be inconvenienced. And you see, that's the trouble with a commitment. Commitments have a way of being inconvenient sometimes. We're a very convenience-oriented society. And commitment can be inconvenient. Because if you have a commitment, that means you are bound and determined to do something. And it may not be convenient to do it right now. There are two different things that can undermine commitment. Hard times and good times. The pressures, the threats, the intimidations, the fears that can be thrown at people can scare them, can frighten them, cause them to back off, can wear them down and discourage them. Or on the other hand, the good times, the easy times, the convenience, the comfort can entice and allure and attract. Just like happened to the Jews in Babylon when Nehemiah was gone. It happened to the Israelites. They kept losing sight of their goal of entering the Promised Land. They lost sight of their commitment. Most of them did. They lost sight of it during hard times, and they lost sight of it during good times. But you know, the Bible is the story of men and women who never did lose sight of their commitment, who never failed to follow through on that commitment. In Hebrews 11, we read of men and women like that. Hebrews 11, in verse 8, By faith, Abraham, when he was called to go out into a place which he should after receive for an inheritance, obeyed, not knowing where he went. By faith he sojourned in the land of promises in a strange country, dwelling in tabernacles with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he looked for a city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. You know, brethren, in many ways the Bible could be called a tale of two cities, Babylon and Jerusalem. The book of Genesis opens with, very shortly after the book of Genesis opens, Babylon comes on the scene. You read about it back in Genesis 11. And Babylon, in some cases, had an allure and an attraction and an enticement. And sometimes it was with force and rigor and violence. Babylon has played a major role. Abraham left Babylonia. That's where the land of the Chaldeans is Babylonia. Abraham left that, and we're told that if he had been mindful of the country from whence he came out, down in verse 15 of Hebrews 11, he could have had opportunity to have returned. Abraham didn't ever want to go back to Babylon. Why? Because he had a different city in mind. You see, he had a different city in mind. He looked for a city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. That's what we're told in verse 10. Because you see, the other city is Jerusalem. We first read of Jerusalem in Genesis 14, where Melchizedek, the king of Salem, came out and met Abraham. And Abraham gave tithes of all to Melchizedek, who was actually, as Paul explains clearly in Hebrews 7, was the one that became Jesus Christ, manifested himself in that way. We read of Jerusalem beginning in Genesis 14, all the way back till you come to the end of the book of Revelation, Revelation 21 and 22. What do you read? You read of the New Jerusalem. See, Revelation 18 tells us that Babylon is fallen. Babylon, the continuation, the successor of the city that Nimrod built, is going to be destroyed forever. But the city of peace, the city of Jerusalem, well, there's a new Jerusalem that's being made right now in heaven by God. It's going to come down out of heaven like a bride adorned for her husband. You can read about it. The New Jerusalem. Revelation chapter 21, 22. Abraham looked for that city. You see, Abraham had, and Moses had, and others had, two things that kept them always mindful of their commitment, and it enabled them to follow through on their commitment. They had vision and they had faith. Without vision, a people perish. When people lose sight of their commitment, you see, hard times and good times have the effect of causing people to get their mind off of the big picture. They lose their focus. They lose sight of what it is that is their commitment. They lose sight of that, and when they lose sight of it, they turn aside. Some of you used to, I know there's some of you used to plow with a mule. What'd you always put on them? Put blinders. Why? Because you didn't want his attention to wander. You didn't want him to get going off one way or going off the other. You wanted the only way he could look was straight ahead, because you had to plow a straight row. You had to be headed in a specific direction. You didn't want to wander and meander all over the place. You see, we have to have the equivalent of spiritual blinders. Our vision has to be fixed on something that we never lose sight of. Those who are the successful overcomers, those who really endure, have vision. They see what it is that they're headed toward. Abraham looked for a city that had foundations. He anticipated what God had for him. He saw it. It was real to him. He believed it. He saw it and he believed it. He believed God. He had vision and he had faith. Any great endeavor, any great accomplishment is pursued by individuals who have vision. They see what it is that is the object of their endeavors. They see it and they're persuaded. They're convinced. They have a faith and a confidence. Let's come on over here in Hebrews 11 in verse 23 or verse 24. We read that Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, esteeming reproach for Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, for he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king. He endured as seeing him who is invisible. Moses had two things to undercut his commitment. He had hard times and he had good times. He refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Moses could have enjoyed the easy times, the good times, as a prince of Egypt. All of the wealth, all of the greatness, all of the pomp and the riches and the treasures of Egypt. Moses had all those things available to him. And later, when Moses rejected that, he esteemed reproach for Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, because he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. He understood what the ultimate reward was. You see, he had vision. He recognized the pleasures of sin are very seasonal, very temporary. The good times didn't hold Moses in Egypt. And you know what? The hard times, the scary times, didn't intimidate him into abandoning his commitment, because we're told here, not fearing the wrath of the king. No matter what the king threatened and no matter what he was told, he endured as seeing him who is invisible. Moses had vision. The invisible God was very real to Moses, more real than a raging Pharaoh right there in front of him. The riches of the kingdom of God were more real to Moses than all of the gold and the glitter and the glamour that Egypt or the Pharaohs had to offer. Moses was a remarkable individual who possessed vision. He saw. And you know what? He had faith to endure. He saw it and he believed it. Brethren, we've been called to a tremendous calling. We have God's calling in front of us. There's got to be a commitment. It says, he that endures to the end, the same shall be saved. To him that overcomes will I grant to sit with me in my throne. That's what the Scriptures tell us. What does it take to overcome and to endure? It takes commitment. I'll put it this way. You will never endure and overcome if you don't have a deep, abiding commitment. Why would you? If you're not committed, if you're not deeply committed, why would you endure? Why would you overcome? How could you? You've got to have a commitment if you're going to successfully carry through on the calling that you and I have been given. But there are things that are going to come at us to undermine that commitment that all of us say we have. When we said we had, when we went under the waters of baptism, we said that we were entering into a commitment with God. But you know, Satan doesn't look and say, well, you know, those people are really serious. They're committed. I certainly don't want to bother them. I won't bother you again. I see you're really committed. I'll leave you alone. Has it worked that way for you? It hadn't worked that way for me. I don't think any of you have had it work that way for you. How does Satan undermine that commitment and cause us to lose sight of it? Well, sometimes it's with the hard times. It's with the things that come at us as a frontal assault to intimidate us, to scare us, to frighten us, or to just wear us down and discourage us. Satan seeks to undermine our commitment through hard times sometimes. But that's not the only way that our commitment can be undermined. Because sometimes the devil works very effectively through good times. Through the allure, the attraction, the enticement of the world. Come on down. That's always proved an allure. Babylon has always had an attraction to those who did not clearly see a city that has foundations. Whether it's hard times or whether it's good times, we're going to maintain our commitment by having vision and having faith. The vision to see it, to realize what it is, to understand why we need to have that commitment, what it is that God offers us. No, Paul says, eye has not seen, ear has not heard, neither has it entered into the hearts of man, the things that God has prepared for them that love Him. But we're told that God reveals it to us. God reveals it. It's not something human beings can just conjure up on their own. But there has to be a spiritual vision of recognizing and seeing what God has to where it's real. Because if you really see it, if you really grasp it, then you recognize there's nothing else to be compared to it. It takes a vision of recognizing it and seeing it, and it takes a faith and a confidence in God to go forward, recognizing that God will do what He has said. We've got to trust Him. We've got to have confidence in Him. We're told that Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, all of them died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off and were persuaded of them and embraced them and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims. They saw it, they believed it, they lived in faith, and they died in faith. They made good on their commitment. They endured to the end. They were committed all the way. And their commitment remained because they had vision and they had faith. Over the weeks and months and years ahead of us, there are going to be good times and there are going to be bad times. There are going to be hard times, there are going to be difficult times, and there are going to be easy times. And they can both eat away and undermine our commitment. To the extent that all of us can be focused through vision on the reality of our calling and have the faith and the confidence to walk with God and to trust Him all the way, then we will follow through on that commitment. We will endure. We will abide in our calling. We have made a commitment to. And we will be there with Abraham and with Moses and with all of the men and women of faith in God's kingdom to inherit that city that has been prepared for us and that will be presented to us.